Tonight, we're about to explore two of the most documented and compelling time-slip cases ever recorded. Stories that will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of time itself. But before we step through these invisible doorways into the past, I want to check in with you and this moment you're in right now. Take a gentle breath and let yourself settle. How was your day? Whatever emotions you're carrying with you tonight, curiosity about the mysteries ahead, perhaps some lingering stress from the hours behind you, fatigue from all you've accomplished, or even restlessness that's been following you around, all of it is welcome here. This is your space now, your time to rest and let go. If you find these kinds of mysterious, sleep-friendly documentaries helpful for winding down, consider subscribing and hitting the bell for notifications. There's something deeply soothing about letting unexplained mysteries wash over you as you drift towards sleep. They remind us that the world holds far more wonder than our daily routines suggest. You don't need to do anything right now except be here. There's no agenda to follow, no problems to solve, no tasks waiting for your attention, just the gentle pull of sleep and the quiet stories that drift between what we know and what we wonder about. Tonight, you're about to hear accounts so detailed and verifiable that they've puzzled researchers for over a century. We'll walk through the summer gardens of Versailles with two British scholars who glimpsed what they believed was Marie Antoinette herself, sketching peacefully just weeks before her world would collapse into revolution. Then we'll stroll the shopping streets of Liverpool with a police officer whose ordinary Saturday afternoon took an impossible detour 40 years into the past. These aren't tales of science fiction or fantasy, but documented experiences reported by credible witnesses, people much like yourself who found reality bending around them in the most unexpected ways. What makes these accounts so compelling isn't just their strangeness, but their specificity. The witnesses described architectural details that were later confirmed by historical research, clothing styles that matched period records, even company names and street layouts that hadn't existed for decades. The witnesses weren't seeking attention or fame. Many published their accounts under false names or spoke reluctantly about what they'd seen. They were teachers, police officers, ordinary people going about their daily lives when time itself seemed to bend around them. These weren't vague dreams or wishful thinking. They were precise, verifiable observations that continue to baffle researchers today. Let these stories wash over you like a gentle tide as we explore them together. There's no need to analyze or question. Just let your mind drift with the rhythm of each account. Whether these experiences reveal something profound about the nature of time, or speak to the mysterious ways our consciousness can play with memory and perception, they remind us that reality might be far more fluid than we dare to imagine. So sink a little deeper into comfort, let your breathing slow naturally, and prepare to drift through some of the most intriguing mysteries ever recorded. You're safe here, held by the quiet darkness, ready to let these gentle enigmas carry you toward peaceful sleep. In the space between waking and sleeping, between the known and the unknowable, perhaps we can find a kind of peace with mystery itself. Part 1. The Scholars at Versailles. The year was 1901, and summer heat shimmered across the gardens of Versailles like a mirage from another century. Two British women, both scholars and educators of impeccable reputation, walked together through the grounds of what had once been the most magnificent palace in Europe. Their names were Charlotte Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, and they had come to France on what they expected to be a perfectly ordinary holiday. Charlotte Moberly was 55 years old, the principal of St Hugh's College at Oxford University. She came from a distinguished family. Her father, George Moberly, had been the headmaster of Winchester College and later Bishop of Salisbury. She was the 10th of 15 children, raised in an atmosphere of scholarly discipline and intellectual rigour. By all accounts, she was a practical woman, more concerned with facts and evidence than flights of fancy. Ellen Jourdain was 37, 12 years younger than her companion, and equally accomplished in academic circles. She had studied at Oxford's Lady Margaret Hall, and had co-founded and served as headmistress of a boarding school. She was considering a position as Moberly's deputy at St Hugh's College, and this trip to France was meant to give them a chance to become better acquainted before making their professional arrangement official. Neither woman considered herself particularly interested in history or the supernatural. They were educators, accustomed to dealing with concrete facts and observable phenomena. As Moberly herself would later write with characteristic understatement, they had very hazy ideas as to where it was or what there was to be seen at Versailles. They thought the visit might prove to be a dull expedition. How wrong they would prove to be? They had arrived at Versailles by train from Paris on a sweltering August morning. The date was August 10th, 1892, exactly 109 years after that same date had marked one of the most terrifying days in the history of the French monarchy. But neither woman was thinking of historical parallels as they made their way through the palace's ornate rooms and corridors. The main palace itself left them somewhat cold. Despite its legendary grandeur, they found it overwhelming and impersonal, too much gilt and marble for their refined British tastes. The crowds of tourists didn't help. They moved through the rooms in chattering groups, their voices echoing off the painted ceilings and mirrored walls. After dutifully touring the state apartments and admiring the famous Hall of Mirrors, both women felt a desire to escape the indoor stuffiness for the open air of the gardens. It was Moberly who suggested they walk to the Petit Trianon. This smaller chateau, built in the style of an intimate country house, had been a gift from King Louis XV to his mistress, Madame de Pompadour. Later, it had become the private retreat of Queen Marie Antoinette, who had used it as an escape from the rigid formality of court life. Here, the doomed queen had played at being a simple shepherdess, dressing in muslin gowns and hosting intimate gatherings far from the watchful eyes of Versailles. The two women consulted their Baedeker guidebook, that reliable companion of educated travellers throughout Europe, and set off through the formal gardens. The grounds of Versailles stretched out before them in geometric perfection, every hedge trimmed to mathematical precision, every path designed to create views that would please the royal eye. But somehow, despite their careful planning and detailed map, they found themselves taking a wrong turn. The Grand Trianon, the larger of the two chateaux, was closed to visitors that day. Disappointed but not deterred, they decided to continue on to the Petit Trianon. According to their guidebook, they should have followed a broad green drive that would have led them straight to their destination. Instead, they found themselves on an unfamiliar lane, walking past landmarks that seemed oddly out of place. Neither woman remarked on this at the time. Gardens, after all, could be confusing places, full of winding paths and unexpected turnings. It was easy enough to lose one's way, especially in the heat of a summer afternoon when the mind might wander and the feet might follow paths of their own choosing. But as they walked deeper into this unfamiliar part of the grounds, something indefinable began to change in the atmosphere around them. The air grew heavy and oppressive, as if a summer storm was approaching, though the sky remained clear and bright. A strange quietness descended over the landscape, muffling the normal sounds of tourists and distant traffic from the roads beyond the palace walls. Both women felt it, though neither mentioned it to the other at the time. There was an unnatural quality to the silence, as if they had stepped into a painting or a theatrical set where all the sounds of real life had been carefully removed. The very light seemed different, softer somehow, more golden, as if filtered through amber glass. It was then that Moberly first noticed the change in the landscape itself. Everything suddenly looked unnatural, therefore unpleasant, she would later recall with the precision of a trained observer. Even the trees seemed to become flat and lifeless, like wood worked in tapestry. The world around them had taken on the quality of a theatrical backdrop, beautiful but somehow artificial, as if they were walking through a painted scene rather than a living landscape. The grass beneath their feet felt different too, springier, more lush, as if it had been recently planted or maintained by gardeners with techniques unknown to the modern world. The very air seemed thicker, laden with scents that were both familiar and strange, the smell of roses, but roses of a variety they couldn't identify, and the earthy scent of soil that had been worked by hands that seemed to belong to another century. And then they began to see the people. At first, the figures in the distance seemed perfectly normal. Gardeners, perhaps, or other palace employees going about their daily tasks. But as the women drew closer, they began to notice details that struck them as odd. The men's clothing, while not obviously out of place, had a subtle difference in cut and style that suggested an earlier era. Their movements, too, seemed different, more formal, more deliberate, as if they were following protocols from a more ceremonious age. Neither Moberly nor Jourdain spoke of these observations to each other as they walked. Each woman kept her growing sense of unease to herself, perhaps afraid of seeming foolish or overwrought from the heat. They continued walking deeper into this strangely transformed landscape, drawn forward by a curiosity they couldn't quite name, and a destination they could no longer clearly see. The path they followed wound through groves of trees that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. The species were recognizable: oak and chestnut, lime and plane trees, but their arrangement felt different, as if they had been planted according to principles of landscape design that were no longer practiced. Some trees seemed older than they should have been, their trunks massive and gnarled with age. Others appeared younger, as if they had been recently planted to fill gaps in an established design. As they walked, both women became aware of a growing sense of being watched. Not in a threatening way, but with the quiet attention of people who were curious about these strangers in their domain. Yet when they looked around, they could see no one observing them. The sensation was unsettling, as if they were performers on a stage they couldn't see, playing roles in a drama they didn't understand. The very quality of sound seemed altered in this transformed landscape. Their footsteps, which should have echoed crisply on the gravel paths, seemed muffled and distant. When they spoke to each other, their voices sounded different, flatter somehow, as if the air itself were absorbing the sound before it could fully form. Even the songs of birds, which should have filled the summer air with cheerful melody, seemed to come from very far away. It was into this increasingly surreal environment that the first clear apparitions began to appear. Part 2. Figures from Another Century. The first figures they encountered appeared gradually, almost imperceptibly, like actors emerging from the wings of a stage. Two men were working among the trees, their movements slow and deliberate as they tended to some unseen task. At first glance, Moberly and Jourdan took them for palace gardeners. Versailles, after all, employed dozens of groundskeepers to maintain its vast and elaborate gardens. But as the women drew closer, the details of the men's appearance began to register more clearly. They were dressed in long coats of a greyish-green colour, a shade that seemed somehow richer and more substantial than modern fabric would allow. The coats themselves were cut in a style that was subtly different from contemporary fashion, longer in the waist, fuller in the skirt, with buttons that caught the light in an unusual way. Most striking of all were their hats, small, three-cornered affairs that belonged unmistakably to an earlier century. These weren't costume pieces or theatrical props, but genuine articles that showed the wear and patina of regular use. The men wore them with natural ease, as if such headgear were the most ordinary thing in the world. Their bearing, too, was different from what one might expect of modern gardeners. There was a dignity about them, an almost official quality that suggested they held positions of some responsibility. When they noticed the two women approaching, they straightened and turned with the practiced courtesy of servants in a grand household. Moberly, gathering her courage, approached them for directions. The men listened politely to her inquiry about the path to the Petit Trianon, their expressions grave and attentive. Their manner was formal but not unfriendly, as if they were accustomed to helping lost visitors, but wanted to observe proper protocols in doing so. "Straight ahead," one of them said, raising his arm to point down the path the women had been following. His voice had an unusual quality, not just the accent, which seemed to belong to an older form of French, but the very timbre of his speech. It was as if he was speaking through water or across a great distance, though he stood only a few feet away. The other man nodded in agreement, his expression solemn and helpful. Both men watched as Moberly and Jourdan thanked them and continued on their way, their eyes following the women's progress with the quiet attention of those who take their duties seriously. It wasn't until much later that the women would realize how strange this encounter had been. The men's clothing, their formal manner, even the particular way they had held themselves, all of it belonged to an earlier era. They had moved and spoken like servants from the time when Versailles was a living palace rather than a museum, when such grounds would have been populated by dozens of retainers, all trained in the elaborate courtesies of royal service. As Moberly and Jourdan walked away from this encounter, the atmosphere around them grew even more oppressive and unreal. The path they followed seemed to wind through landscapes that shifted and changed with dreamlike fluidity. Gardens gave way to woodlands, formal parterres dissolved into wild meadows, and architectural features appeared and disappeared like images half remembered from sleep. It was Jourdan who first noticed the cottage. Nestled among the trees just off the main path, it was a simple structure of weathered stone and timber, with small windows and a thatched roof that spoke of rural French architecture from generations past. The building had an air of age and authenticity that made it seem like a relic from the time when this land had been countryside rather than royal gardens. Standing in the doorway of this cottage were two figures that made Jourdain's blood run cold. A woman and a young girl, both dressed in the simple clothing of country folk, stood perfectly still in the shadow of the doorframe. They didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. Their faces had a waxy artificial quality that suggested they were not living beings at all, but some kind of mannequins or automatons posed to create the illusion of life. The woman wore a dress of coarse brown fabric, her hair covered by a white cap that was tied beneath her chin in the style of rural France from centuries past. The girl beside her, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, was dressed in similar fashion, but with the smaller proportions and simpler styling appropriate to a child. Both figures stared straight ahead with glassy, unseeing eyes that reflected the afternoon light like pieces of painted porcelain. Jordan stopped walking and stared at these figures, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The cottage itself seemed real enough. She could see the texture of the stone walls, the individual pieces of thatch on the roof, even small details like the iron hinges on the wooden door. But the people in the doorway had an unsettling quality that made her skin crawl with instinctive unease. She called softly to Moberly, who was walking slightly ahead, but her companion seemed not to hear. When Jourdain looked back at the cottage, she was startled to see that Moberly appeared completely unaware of the building's existence. Her fellow scholar walked past the spot where the cottage should have been as if nothing were there at all. This was the first clear indication that the two women were not experiencing exactly the same reality. While both felt the oppressive atmosphere and the dreamlike quality of their surroundings, the specific details of what they saw began to diverge in troubling ways. It was as if they were walking through the same landscape but viewing it through different windows, each seeing elements that were invisible to the other. Jourdain hurried to catch up with her companion, casting nervous glances back at the cottage. The building remained stubbornly real to her eyes, its occupants still frozen in their unnatural poses. But Moberly's complete obliviousness to its presence made Jourdain question her own perceptions. Was she seeing things that weren't there? Had the heat and the strange atmosphere finally affected her mind? As they continued walking, both women became aware of other presences in the landscape around them. Figures moved among the trees in the distance, too far away to make out clearly, but close enough to register as human forms going about mysterious business. Some appeared to be working in the gardens, others seemed to be walking along parallel paths, and still others simply stood motionless, like sentries watching over this transformed domain. The clothing of these distant figures, when glimpsed through the trees, seemed consistently different from modern dress. The women saw full skirts and fitted bodices, long coats and knee breeches, hair arranged in styles that belonged to the 18th century. Yet none of these figures seemed to notice the two modern visitors walking among them. It was as if Moberly and Jourdain existed in some parallel dimension that occasionally intersected with this other world, but remained fundamentally separate from it. They could observe the inhabitants of this strange realm, but could not truly interact with them beyond the brief formal exchange with the two gardeners. The path they followed began to descend slightly, leading them through a grove of ancient trees whose branches created a natural cathedral overhead. The light filtering through the leaves had a green, underwater quality that made everything seem to move in slow motion. Their footsteps echoed strangely in this enclosed space, creating multiple reverberations that seemed to come from directions that made no spatial sense. It was here, in the deepest part of this grove, that they encountered the figure who would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. Seated beside a small kiosk or pavilion, half hidden in the dappled shadows, was a man whose appearance filled both women with an immediate and overwhelming sense of revulsion and dread. He was not old, perhaps middle-aged, but his face bore the unmistakable marks of smallpox, deep scars that pitted his skin and gave his features a rough, damaged quality. His complexion was dark, suggesting mixed heritage, and his hair was pulled back in a style that belonged unmistakably to the previous century. He wore a dark cloak or coat that seemed to absorb the light around him, making him appear as a shadow given human form. But it was his expression that truly disturbed the two women. Moberly would later describe it as most repulsive, odious, while Jourdain found it evil and yet unseeing. There was something fundamentally wrong about this figure, something that went beyond mere physical unattractiveness to touch on deeper, more primitive fears. The man's eyes seemed to look through them rather than at them, as if he perceived them only dimly, like figures glimpsed through thick fog. Yet there was an intelligence there, a malevolent awareness that suggested he knew exactly what he was seeing, and found it amusing in some dark way. His lips were curved in what might have been a smile, but it was an expression devoid of warmth or human kindness. Both women felt an overwhelming urge to flee from this figure. Every instinct screamed at them to turn and run, to escape from whatever presence they had encountered in this shadowed grove. The very air around him seemed to thicken with malice, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to think clearly. Yet they found themselves unable to move quickly, as if the atmosphere itself had become viscous and resistant to their movements. They passed the seated figure with slow, deliberate steps, neither daring to look directly at him, nor able to completely ignore his presence. The sensation was like walking through a nightmare, where the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other required tremendous effort and will. As they finally moved beyond his immediate presence, both women felt a palpable sense of relief, as if they had escaped from some terrible danger. But the memory of his face, his expression, and the overwhelming sense of wrongness he had emanated would stay with them for years to come. They would later spend countless hours researching the history of Versailles, trying to identify this disturbing figure and understand what they had encountered in that shadowed grove. Their research would eventually lead them to believe they had seen the Comte de Vaudreuil, a courtier who had lived at Versailles during the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Historical records described him as an ambitious man of mixed Creole heritage, his face marked by smallpox scars, his reputation stained by his ruthless pursuit of power and influence. He had been particularly disliked by Queen Marie Antoinette, who found his presence at court distasteful and his motivations suspect. The Comte de Vaudreuil had died in 1817, more than 80 years before Moberly and Jourdain's visit to Versailles. Yet both women remained convinced that they had encountered him on that strange August afternoon, sitting in his familiar spot like a malevolent guardian watching over the domains he had once sought to influence and control. Part 3. The Lady with the Sketch. After their disturbing encounter with the dark figure in the grove, Moberly and Jourdain found themselves eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the wooded area. The path began to climb slightly, leading them out of the shadows and back into the warm sunlight of the open gardens. But even as they emerged from the trees, the strange dreamlike quality of their experience continued to intensify rather than diminish. It was then that another figure appeared to guide them, this one far more welcome than the malevolent presence they had just left behind. A man approached them from a side path, his manner pleasant and helpful. He was well dressed in the style of a gentleman, though his clothing bore the same subtle differences they had noticed in the other figures. The cut of his coat, the style of his breeches, the particular way his hair was arranged all suggested an earlier period. Unlike the seated figure who had filled them with dread, this man radiated kindness and courtesy. His face was pleasant and intelligent, his expression one of genuine concern for their welfare. When he spoke, his voice had a cultured quality that suggested education and refinement, though it carried that same distant underwater quality they had noticed in the gardener's speech. He seemed to understand immediately that they were lost and looking for the Petit Trianon. Without being asked, he pointed them in the right direction with a gesture that was both helpful and urgent, as if he knew they needed to reach their destination quickly. His manner suggested he was familiar with guiding visitors through these grounds, though his clothing and bearing indicated he was no ordinary servant. Following his directions, the two women found themselves approaching a rustic bridge that spanned a small stream or ornamental water feature. The bridge was charming in its simplicity, rough-hewn stone pillars supporting weathered wooden planks, with simple iron railings that showed the patina of age and weather. Wildflowers grew along the banks of the water, and the sound of running water provided a gentle counterpoint to the unnatural silence that had surrounded them throughout their journey. As they crossed this bridge, both women had the distinct impression that they were moving from one realm into another. The very quality of the light seemed to change as they walked across the wooden planks, becoming softer and more golden, as if filtered through some invisible medium. The air itself felt different, lighter somehow, but also more charged, as if it were filled with possibilities and meanings that remained just beyond their understanding. The gardens on the far side of the bridge were unlike anything in the formal geometric landscapes they had seen earlier. Here was a more natural, English-style garden, where flowers grew in seemingly random profusion, and paths wound through meadows of long grass that moved gently in the afternoon breeze. It was beautiful but also deeply unsettling, as if they were walking through someone else's dream of what a perfect garden should be. The very grass beneath their feet felt different from modern turf. It was lusher, more varied in texture and colour, as if it were composed of species that were no longer commonly cultivated. Wildflowers dotted the meadows in patterns that seemed both natural and artfully arranged, their colours more vivid, and their scents more intense than anything they had encountered in contemporary gardens. As they walked through this transformed landscape, both women became aware of the sound of music drifting through the air. It was faint and distant, but unmistakably present. The light, repetitive melodies of a small ensemble playing the kind of music that might have accompanied outdoor entertainments in an earlier century. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, making it impossible to identify its source, but adding to the increasingly theatrical quality of their experience. The path they followed wound through groves of trees and past ornamental features that seemed both familiar and strange. They saw garden follies and decorative structures that appeared to be authentic period pieces rather than modern reconstructions. Every detail, from the weathering patterns on stone statues to the particular species of climbing roses on pergolas, seemed to belong to an earlier era of landscape design. It was as they emerged from a small grove of lime trees that Moberly first caught sight of the figure who would become the most significant and puzzling element of their entire experience. Sitting on the grass in front of the Petit Trianon, with the charming facade of the chateau serving as her backdrop, was a young woman engaged in sketching. At first glance, she appeared to be simply another visitor to the palace, a fellow tourist taking advantage of the beautiful afternoon to capture the scene in her sketchbook. But as Moberly drew closer, she began to notice details that made her increasingly certain that this was no ordinary visitor from 1901. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s with fair hair that caught the sunlight like spun gold. Her complexion was pale and clear, with the kind of porcelain perfection that suggested a life spent largely indoors, protected from the common effects of sun and weather. She held herself with natural grace, her posture suggesting the kind of deportment training that was given only to young ladies of the highest social class. Her clothing, while beautiful, was what first alerted Moberly to the anachronistic nature of this encounter. The woman wore a light summer dress in a shade of pale green that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The fabric appeared to be silk, but of a quality and weave that suggested earlier manufacturing techniques. The cut of the dress was subtly different from contemporary fashion. The waist sat slightly higher, the sleeves were fuller, and the overall silhouette had the flowing natural lines that had been popular in the 1780s and 90s. Over the dress, she wore a large white fichu, a kind of shawl or neckerchief that was draped around her shoulders and crossed over her breast in the modest fashion of the late 18th century. The fichu was made of the finest muslin, so delicate it seemed almost transparent in the afternoon sunlight. It was arranged with the kind of careful artlessness that required both skill and practice to achieve. On her head was a wide-brimmed straw hat of the type that had been fashionable among ladies of quality during the reign of Louis XVI. The hat was trimmed with ribbon that matched the pale green of her dress, and it cast a becoming shadow over her features that made her appear almost ethereal in the golden light of the afternoon. But it was not just her clothing that marked her as belonging to another era. Her entire manner of being, the way she held her sketching materials, the particular angle at which she sat upon the grass, even the expression of peaceful concentration on her face, all suggested a different age and social context. She appeared completely absorbed in her artistic work, sketching the façade of the Petit Trianon, with the kind of intimate familiarity that comes from long acquaintance with a beloved place. Moberly found herself drawn to observe this figure more closely, fascinated by the anachronistic details of her appearance and behaviour. The woman's sketching technique seemed different from modern methods, more deliberate, more formal, as if she'd been trained in the precise artistic conventions of an earlier period. Her materials, too, appeared to be of antique design. The sketchbook was bound in leather with brass clasps, and her drawing implements looked like genuine period pieces rather than modern reproductions. Most remarkably, the woman seemed completely unaware of the two modern visitors observing her. She continued her sketching with serene concentration, occasionally pausing to study the chateau's facade, or to adjust her position slightly for a better view. Her movements had a natural unconscious grace that suggested she was entirely comfortable in her surroundings and completely absorbed in her artistic pursuit. Moberly called softly to Jourdan, pointing out the sketching woman and wondering aloud about her identity. But when she turned to her companion for confirmation, she was startled to discover that Jourdan appeared to see nothing unusual in the scene before them. Her fellow scholar looked in the direction Moberly indicated, but showed no sign of recognizing the anachronistic figure that had so captured Moberly's attention. This divergence in their perceptions was deeply troubling to both women. Throughout their strange journey, they had shared most of the same experiences: the oppressive atmosphere, the unusual figures in period dress, the sense of having stepped into another time. But now, at what seemed to be the climax of their adventure, they found themselves witnessing completely different realities. Moberly continued to observe the sketching woman with growing fascination and a dawning sense of recognition. There was something hauntingly familiar about the woman's features, though Moberly was certain she had never seen her before. The delicate profile, the particular way the fair hair was arranged beneath the straw hat, the elegant line of her neck and shoulders, all combined to create an impression of someone Moberly felt she should know, someone whose face had been captured in portraits she might have seen but couldn't quite remember. As she watched, the woman occasionally lifted her head from her sketching to gaze thoughtfully at the chateau before her. Her expression during these moments was one of deep melancholy, as if she were seeing not just the building's present beauty but also contemplating its uncertain future. There was a wistfulness in her manner that suggested someone who understood that the world she inhabited was precious and fragile, perhaps already beginning to slip away. The afternoon light began to shift and change as clouds moved across the sun, casting alternating patterns of light and shadow across the scene. During these moments of changing illumination, the sketching woman seemed to become even more ethereal, as if she were not quite solid, not quite anchored to the material world in the same way as ordinary mortals. It was during one of these moments of shifting light that Moberly had her most startling realization about the identity of the figure before her. As the woman lifted her head once again from her sketching and turned slightly in profile, Moberly caught a clear view of her features. The face was unmistakably that of a young woman of aristocratic breeding, with a refined bone structure and delicate complexion that spoke of generations of careful lineage. But more than that, it was a face that Moberly felt certain she had seen before in paintings and engravings, though she couldn't immediately place where or when. The realization came to her gradually, like a half-remembered dream slowly surfacing into consciousness. This was not just any young lady of the 18th century, but someone specific, someone whose image had been preserved for posterity in the formal portraits of the period. As this recognition dawned upon her, Moberly felt a thrill of excitement mixed with terror. If her growing suspicion was correct, then she was witnessing something far more extraordinary than a simple historical vision. She was looking upon someone whose fate had been among the most tragic and well documented in all of European history. Part 4. The investigation unfolds. The spell was broken as suddenly as it had begun. A group of ordinary tourists appeared on the path behind them, chattering in modern French and German, their voices carrying the familiar cadences of the 20th century. The guide leading them wore the standard uniform of the palace guides, and his manner was brisk and professional as he herded his charges toward the entrance of the Petit Trianon. Moberly looked back toward where the sketching woman had been sitting, but the figure had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. The grass where she had been seated showed no impression, no sign that anyone had recently occupied that spot. Even the particular quality of light that had seemed to surround her had returned to normal, leaving Moberly to wonder if she had imagined the entire encounter. Jourdan, meanwhile, seemed relieved to encounter other visitors and eager to join the guided tour of the chateau. She showed no sign of having witnessed anything unusual in the preceding moments, and her manner suggested that she was ready to return to the comfortable reality of ordinary tourism. The two women joined the group and were led through the intimate rooms of Marie Antoinette's private retreat, but Moberly found it difficult to concentrate on the guide's commentary. The interior of the Petit Trianon was charming and elegant, decorated in the refined taste of the late 18th century. But everything appeared perfectly normal. The furnishings were clearly museum pieces, carefully preserved and labelled, with none of the lived-in quality that had characterized the gardens they had just left. The other tourists took photographs and asked questions, and the guide responded with the practiced expertise of someone who had given the same tour hundreds of times before. for the remainder of their visit to Versailles, neither woman mentioned their strange experiences to the other. They completed their tour of the palace grounds, had tea at a nearby cafe, and returned to Paris by the evening train. Both maintained the polite conversation appropriate to travelling companions, discussing the day's sights and their impressions of the famous palace. But underneath their ordinary chatter, each woman carried a growing conviction that something extraordinary had occurred. It wasn't until a week later, when they had returned to England and Moberly was writing a letter to her sister about their French holiday, that the subject finally came into the open. As she described their visit to Versailles, Moberly found herself hesitating over how to characterize their experience at the Petit Trianon. Finally, almost casually, she asked Jourdain if she thought the place might be haunted. Jourdain's immediate response, "Yes, I do think so," opened the floodgates of a conversation that would consume both women for the next decade. As they compared their memories of that August afternoon, they realized that they had shared an experience that defied all conventional explanation. Both had felt the oppressive atmosphere. Both had seen figures in period dress. Both had experienced the dreamlike quality that had transformed the familiar gardens of Versailles into something altogether different. Three months later, safely ensconced in Moberly's study at St. Hugh's College, the two women decided to write independent accounts of their experience while their memories were still fresh. They agreed not to consult each other during this process, hoping that separate narratives would either confirm the reality of what they had witnessed, or reveal the inconsistencies that might suggest hallucination or shared delusion. When they compared these written accounts, they were struck by both the similarities and the differences in their experiences. Both had noted the same atmospheric changes, the same sense of temporal displacement, the same encounters with figures in 18th century dress, but the specific details often diverged in ways that were both puzzling and intriguing. Jourdain had seen the cottage with its wax-like occupants, while Moberly had noticed no such building. Moberly had observed the sketching woman in vivid detail, while Jourdain remained convinced that no such figure had been present. Yet both accounts contained elements that seemed to corroborate historical facts neither woman could have known beforehand. Rather than dismissing their experience as a shared delusion, Moberly and Jourdain decided to investigate it with the same scholarly rigour they would apply to any academic problem. They began what would become one of the most thorough investigations of a paranormal experience ever undertaken, spending years in libraries and archives, consulting historical documents and contemporary accounts, trying to verify every detail of what they claimed to have witnessed. Their first major discovery came when they researched the significance of the date of their visit. August 10th, they learned, was not just any summer day in the history of Versailles. It was the anniversary of one of the most traumatic events in the final years of the French monarchy, the day in 1792 when the Tuileries Palace in Paris was stormed by revolutionary forces, marking the beginning of the end for King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. On that terrible August day more than a century before their visit, Marie Antoinette had been at the Petit Trianon, enjoying what would prove to be among her last peaceful moments at her beloved retreat. Within weeks, she would be imprisoned in the Temple Tower, and within a year she would meet her fate on the scaffold. Could the two women have somehow witnessed an echo of that fateful day, when the Queen and her court still clung to the illusion that their world would continue unchanged? As their research progressed, Moberly and Jourdain found increasingly specific corroboration for details from their experience. The man with the pockmarked face who had filled them with such dread began to take on a definite historical identity. Their investigation led them to the Comte de Vaudreuil, a courtier who had indeed lived at Versailles during the reign of Louis XVI. Contemporary accounts described Vaudreuil as an ambitious man of mixed Creole heritage, his face scarred by smallpox, his reputation stained by his ruthless pursuit of power and influence. He had been particularly disliked by Queen Marie Antoinette, who found his presence at court distasteful and his motivations suspect. His appearance, his manner, even his preferred haunts within the palace grounds, all matched the details the two women remembered from their disturbing encounter. Even more remarkably, they found historical records that seemed to validate details they couldn't possibly have known beforehand. In 1908, 7 years after their experience, Moberly discovered the journal of Madame Eloff, Marie Antoinette's dressmaker. The journal contained detailed descriptions of clothing made for the Queen during the summer of 1789. According to Eloff's meticulous records, she had made Marie Antoinette 2 green silk bodices, large white fichus of the finest muslin, and a skirt in a slightly yellowish shade during that fateful summer. This agrees exactly with the dress seen in 1901, Moberly noted with amazement, referring to her detailed memory of the sketching woman's attire. The fichu in particular was a telling detail. This type of neckerchief had been a signature element of Marie Antoinette's preferred style of dress, reflecting her preference for the simpler, more natural fashions inspired by English country dress, rather than the elaborate court costumes traditionally worn at Versailles. The Queen's adoption of this modest style had actually been criticised by some courtiers as inappropriate to her royal status. But perhaps the most extraordinary validation came from Moberly's return visit to Versailles in January of 1902. Hoping to retrace their steps and perhaps understand their experience better, she travelled alone to the palace during the winter season, when tourist crowds would be minimal and the atmosphere might be more conducive to whatever phenomenon they had encountered. Once again, Moberly found herself lost in the same area where their original experience had occurred. As she wandered through the winter landscape, trying to find her way back to familiar paths, she began to hear something that made her stop in her tracks and listen intently. Drifting through the crisp winter air came the sound of music. Faint music as of a band not far off, as she would later describe it. She moved toward the sound, following it through the bare trees and frost-covered gardens. As she drew closer, she could make out the specific character of the music. Very light music with a good deal of repetition in it, played by what sounded like a small ensemble of period instruments. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and utterly unfamiliar, yet it had a quality that seemed to belong unmistakably to an earlier century. The rhythms, the harmonies, the very style of the composition all suggested the kind of music that might have been performed for outdoor entertainments during the reign of Louis XVI. It was delicate and courtly, with the mathematical precision and ornamental flourishes characteristic of 18th century composition. Moberly stood transfixed, listening to this impossible concert that seemed to be taking place somewhere just beyond her sight. The music was so clear and distinct that she found herself able to memorize specific passages, committing the melody to memory with the precision of someone trained in musical notation. When she returned to England, Moberly immediately wrote down what she'd heard, transcribing 12 bars of the mysterious music from memory. The notation came to her effortlessly, as if the melody had been burned into her consciousness during those magical moments in the winter gardens of Versailles. In 1907, 5 years after her winter experience, Moberly showed her transcribed music to an expert in historical composition. The musicologist examined the notation carefully, analysing its harmonic structure, rhythmic patterns, and stylistic characteristics. His conclusion was unequivocal. The music dated from approximately 1780, the exact period when Marie Antoinette had held her most elaborate entertainments at the Petit Trianon. The caretakers at Versailles, when consulted, confirmed that no musical performances of any kind were permitted in the palace gardens during the winter months. The weather, the acoustics, and simple practical considerations made outdoor concerts impossible during January. Yet Mobley had heard music that was not only historically appropriate, but compositionally sophisticated enough to require trained musicians and period instruments. Part 5. A Shopping Trip Through Time. Nearly a century later and hundreds of miles away from the manicured gardens of Versailles, another time slip would capture the public imagination with its thoroughly modern setting and impeccably documented details. The location was Bold Street in Liverpool, England, a bustling commercial thoroughfare lined with shops, cafes, and the kind of urban energy that characterised British city centres in the final years of the 20th century. The year was 1996, and the witness was a man known only as Frank, a detail that would become significant as his story spread through paranormal circles and internet forums in the years that followed. Frank was an off-duty police officer from Merseyside, a fact that lent considerable credibility to his account. Police officers, after all, are trained observers, accustomed to noticing details and describing events with precision and accuracy. Bold Street itself was and remains one of Liverpool's most distinctive shopping areas. Running from the grand neoclassical facade of St Luke's Church at its upper end down to the bustling commercial district near the waterfront, it had been transformed over the decades from a Victorian residential area into a vibrant pedestrian precinct filled with independent shops, record stores, bookshops, and cafes. The street's character in the 1990s was eclectic and bohemian, attracting students from the nearby universities, music enthusiasts drawn by its excellent record shops, and browsers who enjoyed its mixture of vintage clothing stores, alternative bookshops, and quirky independent retailers. It was the kind of place where you might find anything from first edition books to vintage band t-shirts, from ethnic restaurants to new age crystal shops. On this particular Saturday afternoon in July, Frank had come to the city centre with his wife Carol for a leisurely shopping expedition. Liverpool's city centre was bustling with weekend shoppers, street performers, and the general human energy that characterised any major British city on a sunny summer afternoon. The pedestrianised areas were filled with families, teenagers, and tourists, all going about the pleasant business of browsing, buying, and simply enjoying the day. Frank and Carol had decided to split up to pursue their separate shopping interests, a common enough practice for couples who had learned that they could cover more ground and find more interesting items if they didn't feel obligated to stick together for every transaction. Carol wanted to browse in Dillon's bookstore, one of Bold Street's most popular destinations, while Frank had his eye on a particular record shop where he hoped to find a compact disc he'd been seeking. They arranged to meet at Dillon's in about an hour, giving each of them time to pursue their own interests before reconvening to compare purchases, and perhaps find somewhere for afternoon tea. It was an arrangement they had made dozens of times before in various cities and shopping districts, and Frank set off for the record shop with the satisfied anticipation of someone about to indulge in a favourite hobby. The record shop was located on Ranelagh Street, one of the roads that intersected with Bold Street near the heart of Liverpool's shopping district. Frank found what he was looking for without difficulty, a reissue of an album he had been wanting to add to his collection, completed his purchase, and set off to meet his wife at the bookstore. The walk from Ranelagh Street to Dillon's required him to turn left onto Bold Street and walk past several blocks of shops and cafes. It was a route he had taken many times before, through familiar territory that held no surprises or complications. On this particular afternoon, the street was moderately busy but not crowded, with shoppers moving at the leisurely pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be. As Frank approached the Lyceum, he passed one of Bold Street's most distinctive landmarks. The Lyceum was a magnificent 19th-century neoclassical building that had originally served as a gentleman's club and reading room. By the 1990s, it housed the post office and served as an unofficial gateway to Bold Street's main shopping area. The building's grand facade, with its classical columns and imposing stone steps, provided a sense of historical continuity in an area that had undergone considerable modernisation over the decades. For regular visitors to Bold Street, the Lyceum served as a familiar reference point, a reassuring constant in a district that was always evolving with new shops, restaurants, and cultural attractions. It was as Frank passed this familiar landmark that something extraordinary began to happen. The first indication that anything was amiss came not through sight, but through sound, or rather, through the sudden absence of sound that should have been there. In the middle of one of Liverpool's busiest shopping areas, on a Saturday afternoon when the streets should have been filled with the ordinary cacophony of urban life, Frank suddenly found himself enveloped in what he would later describe as an oasis of quietness. The change was so sudden and complete that it was almost physical in its impact. The normal sounds of city life, traffic from the nearby roads, conversations of passing shoppers, the distant hum of air conditioning units and the occasional siren, all seemed to fade away as if someone had gradually turned down the volume on the entire world. What replaced this familiar urban soundtrack was not complete silence, but rather a different kind of quiet, pregnant with possibility and strangely expectant. Frank paused, momentarily disoriented by this acoustic shift. As a police officer, he was trained to notice changes in his environment, and this sudden alteration in the soundscape immediately put him on alert. He looked around, trying to identify what might have caused this phenomenon, but everything appeared perfectly normal. Shoppers continued to move along the pedestrianised street. Shops remained open with their doors invitingly ajar, and the afternoon sunlight continued to cast familiar shadows between the buildings. It was then that the van appeared. The vehicle came from his left, emerging from what should have been the pedestrianised section of Bold Street with a suddenness that made Frank jump backward in alarm. It was a small box van, unmistakably from an earlier era in automotive design. Probably the 1950s, Frank estimated, based on its rounded lines, high stance, and the particular proportions that characterised commercial vehicles from that period. The van's bodywork was painted in the utilitarian colours typical of working vehicles from that era, a cream or light yellow base with darker trim and professional lettering on the sides. But it was not just the vehicle's appearance that marked it as belonging to another time. It moved with the particular rhythm and sound of older automotive technology, the deeper engine note, the different transmission whine, even the specific quality of tyre noise that characterised vehicles built before modern engineering had refined away these distinctive characteristics. As the van passed directly in front of him, close enough that Frank could have reached out and touched it, the driver sounded his horn. The sound was unmistakably different from modern vehicle horns, deeper, more resonant, with the particular timbre that came from the mechanical horn systems used in mid-century commercial vehicles. It was a sound that belonged to a different era of motoring, when horns were substantial mechanical devices rather than the electronic systems that had replaced them. The horn blast served as both a warning and an indication that the driver had seen Frank standing in the roadway. Frank jumped back instinctively, his reflexes honed by years of police work responding automatically to the potential danger. But as he stepped backward to avoid the vehicle, he realised something that sent a chill of impossibility down his spine. He was standing in the middle of an active road. Bold Street, which had been pedestrianised for years and which Frank had walked dozens of times before, was once again functioning as a street open to vehicle traffic. The familiar paving stones and pedestrian-friendly layout had been replaced by ordinary tarmac, marked with the painted lines and road markings of a functioning thoroughfare. Cars and vans moved along it with the steady flow of urban traffic, their drivers showing none of the confusion or concern that would be expected if vehicles had suddenly gained access to what should have been a pedestrian-only area. Frank stood on the side of this impossible road, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. The transformation was complete and seamless. Not just the road surface, but the entire character of the street had changed. The familiar shops and buildings were still there, but they appeared different, as if they had been subtly altered or restored to an earlier configuration. As his eyes adjusted to this transformed Liverpool, Frank began to notice other details that confirmed he was no longer in the 1990s city centre he knew so well. The vehicles moving along the street were uniformly older in design. Not antique cars driven by enthusiasts, but working vehicles that showed the normal wear and patina of everyday use. Delivery trucks, private cars, even the occasional bus all belonged to an earlier era of automotive design, their shapes and proportions speaking of a time when efficiency and economy took precedence over the aerodynamic styling that had come to dominate modern vehicle design. But it was not just the vehicles that had changed. Looking toward where Dylan's bookstore should have been, Frank saw instead a shop front that bore the name Cripps, in lettering that appeared to be original rather than a modern reproduction. The style of the signage, the particular fonts used, even the way the letters were arranged, all suggested authentic period advertising, rather than the retro styling that had become popular in contemporary commercial design. The window display beneath this unfamiliar shop sign contained merchandise that seemed to belong to the same earlier era as the vehicles and signage. Instead of the books, literary magazines, and contemporary publications that should have filled Dylan's windows, Frank saw an array of ladies' accessories, handbags, shoes, gloves, and other items of apparel that appeared to be genuine vintage pieces rather than modern reproductions. The handbags in particular caught his attention. They were substantial, well-made pieces in leather and fabric, with the kind of craftsmanship and attention to detail that spoke of an era when such items were built to last for decades rather than seasons. The styles were unmistakably from the 1940s or 50s, structured shapes with metal clasps, handles that showed the wear of regular use, and decorative elements that reflected the aesthetic preferences of an earlier generation of consumers. The shoes displayed alongside the handbags were equally authentic in their period details. Frank could see women's pumps with the pointed toes and modest heels that had been fashionable in the post-war era, as well as more practical styles that suggested the kind of footwear worn by working women during a time when comfort and durability were more important than the constantly changing fashions that would characterize later decades. As Frank stood transfixed by this impossible storefront, he became aware of the people moving around him on this transformed Bold Street. Like everything else in this shifted reality, they appeared to belong to an earlier era. The men wore overcoats and hats even in the summer weather, their clothing cut in the styles that had been standard before casual dress became acceptable for public appearances. The women were even more obviously from another time. They wore headscarves tied beneath their chins in the practical fashion that had been common during and after the war years, when protecting one's hairstyle from wind and weather was a daily concern. Their gloves, handbags, and shoes all matched the items displayed in the shop windows, creating a coherent picture of a time when public appearance required careful attention to properly coordinated accessories. Most remarkably, their behaviour and deportment reflected the social conventions of an earlier era. They moved with a more formal bearing, maintaining the kind of public reserve that had been expected in the days before casual social interaction became the norm. Men tipped their hats to ladies they passed, couples walked with a proper distance between them, and everyone seemed to observe the unspoken rules of public conduct that had governed urban life in the post-war decades. The very atmosphere of the street felt different, more purposeful somehow, as if shopping was still considered a serious business, requiring proper dress and behaviour, rather than the casual leisure activity it had become by the 1990s. People moved with destination in mind, their manner suggesting the kind of focused efficiency that characterised an era when time and money were more carefully managed resources. Yet among all these authentically period figures, Frank noticed something that provided a reassuring link to his own time. Walking among the women in headscarves and the men in overcoats was a young woman who appeared to be in her 20s and was dressed in thoroughly contemporary clothing. She wore a lime-coloured sleeveless top of modern cut and fabric and carried a handbag that Frank recognised as a popular brand from the 1990s. This young woman seemed as out of place in the 1950s streetscape as Frank himself, and when their eyes met, he saw in her expression the same mixture of confusion and fascination that he was experiencing. She appeared to be equally aware that something extraordinary was happening, and equally uncertain about how to respond to finding herself in what appeared to be a different decade. Their shared recognition of the situation created an immediate, unspoken bond between them. Here were two people from the same era, suddenly finding themselves witnesses to the same impossible phenomenon. Without speaking, they acknowledged their mutual displacement from normal reality, and Frank found himself following her as she approached the entrance to the shop that now bore the name Cripps instead of Dillon's. Part 6. The Return to the Present. The young woman in the lime-coloured top moved toward the entrance of Cripps with the same mixture of curiosity and trepidation that Frank was feeling. Her modern clothing made her stand out dramatically against the backdrop of 1950s shoppers, yet none of the period figures seemed to notice her anachronistic presence. It was as if she existed in some parallel layer of reality that occasionally intersected with this historical tableau but remained fundamentally separate from it. Frank watched as she approached the shop window, studying the display of vintage accessories with the same fascination he had experienced. Her expression suggested she was trying to make sense of what she was seeing, attempting to reconcile the familiar location with its impossible transformation. She reached toward the door handle with the tentative movement of someone who wasn't entirely sure what she might find on the other side. Acting on impulse, Frank decided to follow her into the shop. Whatever was happening to them, they seemed to be experiencing it together, and he felt an instinctive need to maintain contact with the only other person who appeared to share his displacement from normal time and space. As he approached the entrance, he could see through the window that the interior of the shop matched its exterior transformation. Display cases filled with period merchandise, fixtures and fittings that belonged to an earlier era of retail design. The moment both of them crossed the threshold together, everything changed. The transformation was instantaneous and complete, like a film cut or a theatrical scene change. The interior snapped back to the familiar layout of Dylan's bookstore, with a suddenness that was almost physically jarring. Gone were the glass display cases filled with handbags and accessories, replaced by the comforting sight of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves laden with paperbacks, hardcovers, and literary magazines. The lighting changed from the warm, yellowish glow of period fixtures to the bright, even illumination of modern fluorescent systems. The floor covering shifted from worn wooden boards to contemporary carpeting, and the very smell of the place transformed from the mixture of leather goods and old building materials to the familiar scent of new books and fresh paper. Frank and the young woman found themselves standing just inside the entrance of a perfectly ordinary 1990s bookstore, surrounded by the expected inventory of contemporary publications, bestseller displays, and promotional materials. Other customers browsed the shelves with the casual manner of modern shoppers, and the staff moved about their duties with the relaxed efficiency characteristic of retail workers in the final years of the 20th century. Both Frank and his companion stood motionless for a moment, their minds struggling to process what had just occurred. They had stepped from one era into another simply by walking through a doorway, experiencing a transition that should have been impossible, but had felt completely natural in the moment it happened. Frank turned to the young woman, needing confirmation that he hadn't imagined the entire experience. Her expression mirrored his own confusion and amazement, suggesting that she had witnessed the same transformation. The shared nature of their experience made it impossible to dismiss as hallucination or wishful thinking. Whatever had happened to them, it had been real enough to be perceived by two completely independent observers. "Did you see what I saw?" Frank asked her, his voice reflecting both wonder and the need for verification that any trained observer would feel when confronted with something that challenged his understanding of reality. The young woman nodded, her expression still showing the disorientation they both felt. "Yes," she replied, shaking her head as if trying to clear it of impossible memories. "I thought it was a clothes shop, not a bookstore. I was going to look at the handbags in the window, but then—" She gestured around them at the familiar interior of Dylan's, her voice trailing off as she confronted the impossibility of what they had both experienced. Here was independent confirmation of the most crucial elements of Frank's experience: the transformation of the bookstore into a vintage clothing shop, the presence of merchandise from an earlier era, and the sudden reversion to normal reality upon entering the building. With that simple exchange, two strangers had confirmed that they had shared an impossible experience. Both had seen the same temporal displacement, witnessed the same shift from present to past and back again. Both had observed the transformation of a familiar modern bookstore into a vintage clothing shop, then watched it change back before their eyes in the space of a single footstep. The implications of this shared experience were profound and troubling. If only one of them had witnessed the phenomenon, it could have been dismissed as hallucination, mental fatigue, or the kind of perceptual glitch that occasionally affects even the most reliable observers. But the fact that two independent witnesses had seen identical details suggested that something genuinely extraordinary had occurred. After a few more moments of mutual amazement, the young woman excused herself and disappeared into the depths of the bookstore, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts and memories. He never saw her again, and despite occasional efforts to locate her through mutual friends and local inquiries, she remained as mysterious as the experience they had shared. Some accounts of Frank's story suggest that she may have been as reluctant as he initially was to discuss what had happened, preferring to keep the experience private rather than risk ridicule or disbelief. Frank found his wife Carol browsing in the poetry section, completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred. Her day had proceeded exactly as planned. She had spent a pleasant hour browsing through the bookstore's inventory, had selected several paperbacks for purchase, and was ready to reconvene with her husband for the next phase of their shopping expedition. Frank debated whether to tell her immediately about his experience, but something held him back. The phenomenon had been so extraordinary, so far outside the bounds of normal experience, that he wasn't sure how to begin explaining it. How could he describe stepping back in time while doing something as mundane as crossing a street to meet her at a bookstore? Instead, he accompanied her through the remainder of their shopping trip, making appropriate responses to her observations about the books she had found and the other shops she wanted to visit. But throughout the afternoon, his mind kept returning to those impossible minutes when Bold Street had transformed itself into a thoroughfare from the 1950s, complete with period vehicles, vintage clothing, and authentic details that couldn't possibly have been staged or imagined. That evening, in the comfort of their own home, Frank finally told Carol what had happened. He described the experience carefully, sticking to the facts as he remembered them, and avoiding speculation about causes or explanations. His training as a police officer had taught him the importance of accurate testimony, and he wanted to record the details while they were still fresh in his memory. Carol's initial reaction was skeptical but not dismissive. She knew her husband well enough to recognize that he was describing something he genuinely believed had occurred, and his reputation for reliability and attention to detail made it difficult to simply dismiss his account. Over the following days, she encouraged him to research the historical details he remembered, hoping that verification or contradiction of these elements might help explain what had happened. Frank's investigation into the historical accuracy of his experience yielded results that were both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Cripps, the name he had seen on the shopfront, had indeed been a women's clothing and accessories store in Liverpool during the post-war period. The business had operated from that exact location on Bold Street, selling the kind of handbags, shoes and accessories that Frank remembered seeing in the transformed window display. Even more specifically, Cripps had been established by John Cripps, a shawl merchant and manufacturer who had moved into the premises in 1848. By the 1940s and 50s, the period that Frank believed he had witnessed, the store had evolved into exactly the kind of ladies' accessory shop he had observed, specialising in quality handbags, gloves, and other items of apparel for the discerning Liverpool shopper. The van that had nearly collided with him yielded equally compelling historical verification. Kaplan's, the name he'd seen painted on the vehicle's side, had been a well-established Liverpool transport and delivery company during the exact period he believed he had witnessed. The company had operated a fleet of small commercial vehicles throughout the city, providing delivery services for local businesses and maintaining the kind of utilitarian cream and dark trim paint scheme that Frank remembered. The specific type of vehicle, a small box van with the rounded lines and high stance characteristic of 1950s commercial design, matched exactly the kind of delivery trucks that Kaplan's had used during their heyday. Even details like the deeper engine note and the particular quality of the horn blast that had warned Frank to get out of the road corresponded to the mechanical systems used in commercial vehicles of that era. Most remarkably, Frank's description of Bold Street itself as an active roadway rather than a pedestrianised shopping area matched the historical reality of the location during the time period he believed he had visited. The street had indeed carried vehicle traffic during the 1940s and 50s, with the pedestrianisation that Frank knew as normal having been implemented only in later decades as part of Liverpool's urban renewal efforts. Frank never stopped talking about his experience on Bold Street. As word of his story spread through local networks of friends, colleagues, and fellow police officers, it became one of the most well-documented and frequently cited examples of the time-slip phenomenon. His background in law enforcement, his reputation for reliability and attention to detail, and his initially reluctant attitude toward discussing the experience all contributed to its credibility among both believers and skeptics. More importantly, Frank's account became the first in what would prove to be a series of similar reports from Bold Street and the surrounding area. Over the following years, other witnesses would come forward with their own stories of temporal displacement in the same location, creating a pattern that transformed Bold Street into one of the most famous paranormal hotspots in the United Kingdom. Some of these subsequent accounts involved shoppers who found themselves browsing in stores that had ceased to exist decades earlier. Others described encounters with people dressed in period clothing, who seemed unaware of the anachronistic nature of their appearance. Still others reported architectural changes, buildings appearing or disappearing, street layouts reverting to earlier configurations, even the presence of infrastructure like railway lines that had been removed from the area years before. The accumulation of these reports created a compelling body of evidence that something unusual was occurring in this particular part of Liverpool. While skeptics could dismiss individual accounts as misperceptions or fabrications, the consistency of details across multiple independent witnesses suggested a phenomenon that deserved serious investigation. Various theories have been proposed to explain the Bold Street time slips. Some researchers have pointed to the area's complex underground infrastructure, including railway tunnels, utility conduits, and basement connections between buildings that create an intricate network beneath the shopping district. They suggest that this underground complexity might somehow interact with electromagnetic fields or geological features to create conditions conducive to temporal anomalies. Others have noted that Bold Street sits at the intersection of several major transportation routes and utility corridors, creating what some theorists describe as a kind of energy vortex, where different types of electromagnetic activity might interfere with normal perceptions of time and space. The nearby railway systems, underground electrical cables, and communications networks all contribute to a complex electromagnetic environment that might theoretically affect human consciousness in unusual ways. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Bold Street phenomenon is its democratic nature. Unlike many paranormal experiences that seem to be limited to individuals with particular sensitivities or beliefs, the Bold Street time slips have been reported by people from all walks of life. Police officers, students, shopkeepers, tourists, and local residents with no previous interest in the supernatural or unexplained. The witnesses have included hardcore skeptics who found their worldview challenged by what they experienced, as well as people who had never given any thought to the possibility of time travel or temporal anomalies. This broad spectrum of witnesses, combined with the specific and verifiable historical details they report, has made Bold Street a subject of serious study for researchers interested in the nature of time, consciousness, and the possibility that reality might be far more fluid than our everyday experience suggests. Frank's original experience remains the template against which other Bold Street accounts are measured. His careful documentation of details, his professional background, and his initial reluctance to publicize his story have made his account a cornerstone of time-slip research. More than 25 years after his Saturday afternoon shopping trip took an impossible detour into the past, his story continues to fascinate and puzzle anyone who encounters it. And so these mysteries remain, documented and investigated, but never fully explained. Two scholarly women at Versailles experiencing echoes of a vanished royal court in the summer gardens, where Marie Antoinette once sought refuge from the approaching storm of revolution. A police officer in Liverpool stepping briefly into his city's post-war past while on an ordinary shopping expedition with his wife. These accounts, separated by nearly a century and hundreds of miles, share remarkable similarities. Both involved ordinary people going about mundane activities when time itself seemed to bend around them. Both featured witnesses whose professional backgrounds and personal reputations made them reliable observers. Both included specific, verifiable details that could be confirmed through historical research, but were unknown to the witnesses at the time of their experiences. Most importantly, both stories suggest that the boundaries between past and present might be far more permeable than we normally assume. Whether these experiences represent actual travel through time, glimpses of residual energy from past events, or manifestations of consciousness that we don't yet understand, they remind us that reality contains depths and complexities that science has yet to fully explore. In the gentle space between waking and sleeping, where logic softens and possibility expands, perhaps such mysteries become less troubling and more wonderful. Perhaps in dreams we find a realm where time flows differently, where past and present can coexist, where the boundaries of the possible stretch to accommodate experiences that daylight logic would dismiss. Let these stories carry you now into that deeper rest, where the constraints of linear time dissolve into the timeless peace of sleep. In that quiet darkness, all mysteries find their resolution, all questions discover their answers, and all impossibilities become simply another way of understanding the infinite strangeness and beauty of existence. Whether time slips are windows into the past, products of extraordinary perception, or manifestations of consciousness that we have yet to comprehend, they remind us that the world holds far more wonder than our daily experience suggests. They invite us to remain open to mystery, to maintain our sense of awe, and to remember that reality might be far more magical and fluid than we ever dared to imagine. Sleep well, knowing that time itself might be far stranger and more wonderful than we know. Rest in the peace of mystery, in the comfort of questions that don't require immediate answers, in the gentle certainty that the universe holds depths we have only begun to explore. Sweet dreams.